didn't, about what Ambassador John Bolton said and who was worried and who raised concerns as all of this unfolded. Up with me this hour, Eli Stokols. He's a White House reporter for the Los Angeles Times, his hometown newspaper. Christina Greer is an associate professor of political science at Fordham. She's the author of the book Black Ethnics. Katie Fang is an MSNBC legal contributor. And also with us from Washington, D.C. is Andrew Desiderio. He is a congressional reporter for Politico. Andrew, get us up to speed. You and Kyle Cheney have been doing great reporting over these last many weeks on how this process is unfolding, how it has unfolded, and let's get to this. The calls for the whistleblower to be identified, to be unmasked, and to testify, juxtaposed with what we know now. How much is that, would you say, the Republican response to this? They are centering so much here on the whistleblower complaint itself.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And what Ivanka Trump said, I think you would find a lot of Democrats who really agree with that, right? She said essentially the whistleblower is irrelevant right now. I think Democrats would say the same because, as you mentioned before, they've had hundreds of hours of witness testimony that has corroborated the central claims, one of which I'm told Democrats want to focus on next week during the public hearings is the part of the whistleblower complaint where there is basically an alleged cover-up, right? The idea that these National Security Council lawyers tried to put the call transcript, the fuller call transcript, which of course we don't have at this point, onto a highly classified server to ensure that it wouldn't get out and nobody across the government, and certainly not the public, would be able to see it. That's something that Democrats are really going to focus on in the hearing next week. It hasn't gotten as much attention amid the talks of these two, of course, parallel foreign policies, one being the U.S. government foreign policy with regard to Ukraine, and the second being the one that Rudy Giuliani pushed, and of course the allegations of a quid pro quo. But this is really a central part of Democrats' case, and they're not going to just let it go by the wayside next week during the public hearings.
Andrew, you're pulling on a string there that was in Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman's testimony. He talked about him trying to get stuff restored in that record that the White House made and how that was removed afterward. He is not yet on the docket. We're not going to see him testifying publicly next week. One would think that perhaps he would in these coming days. Walk us through what happens after Friday of next week, after we hear from Marie Yovanovitch, the former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine. What Democrats on the House Intelligence Committee are going to do next, who we might hear from the week after?
So they obviously haven't announced who's going to appear for public hearings the following week, but there will be at least 2 or 3 public hearings that week, I'm told. Colonel Vindman obviously is going to be at the top of their list. Fiona Hill, the former top Russia advisor on the National Security Council, is also going to be high on that list. Anybody who can essentially speak to the public to back up the allegations of a quid pro quo. The first part of that being the idea that the White House meeting between President Trump and President Zelensky was used as leverage to get these politically motivated investigations that the president wanted. The second aspect of that being, of course, the military aid to Ukraine. Democrats feel like they have less evidence of that and more evidence that the meeting was leveraged as part of the quid pro quo. And the military aid remains a glaring blind spot for them. I've talked to Democrats who say that basically the reason why they haven't figured out why the aid was initially put on hold and sort of what the internal machinations of that were is because these officials from the Office of Management and Budget just have not shown up. Out of all of these sort of executive branch departments and agencies who have been asked to participate in this impeachment inquiry, OMB is the only office that has not participated at all. At least 4 officials from that office have been asked to testify. A couple of them have even been subpoenaed. None of them have shown up. So that really is a glaring blind spot for Democrats as they head into the public hearings, and it's going to be something they have to address when they're talking about these allegations of a quid pro quo.
Christina Greer, let's turn to these transcripts and what's coming into focus as we make our way through all of them. And we're seeing divides that emerge between and among members of this administration. The one that's front and center today is that between Mick Mulvaney, acting chief of staff, and to Andrew's point just a moment ago, still, I think, titularly the head of the Office of Management and Budget in this administration. But that's a binary that we're going to be looking at very closely here as we continue to go through those transcripts, as we make our way through them, and as we look to these hearings this coming week.
Right. I mean, there are a few things. One, when are subpoenas optional? I mean, and this is what worries me.
The lawyer at the table is laughing.
Right. I mean, so Katie can help us understand that. But I mean, I was under the understanding if you are subpoenaed, you must present yourself. I mean, what worries me is that the United States government works only when the various branches of government uphold their duties. And what we are seeing time and time again, every Sunday we talk about this, is that there are people who should be loyal to the U.S. government, and instead they are loyal to the president. And we know that the president, he himself has said what has been on the phone call. We know that we don't have a complete transcript. And so as the Democrats are trying to gather this information, about the Ukraine phone call, we must simultaneously move forward with impeachment hearings because the evidence has been there since probably early January 2017. So unfortunately, I think a lot, I would say 50% of the American public is getting a little frustrated because it seems as though there's overwhelming evidence that this process should and could be farther along down the road because the president has been consistently breaking norms, but also possibly breaking laws that he's admitted himself.
Get to the subpoena question in just a minute, but quickly here, Eli, let me ask you just about another contrast that's emerging as you look at all of these, and that is, to Christina's point, you have people who are loyal to the president. That's coming out in these transcripts. But then, as you read what Fiona Hill had to say, what George Kent had to say, these are people who have had for a long time a real loyalty to this country and to the institutions themselves. There's a moment in Fiona Hill's testimony where somebody asks her, and I'm paraphrasing here, what did you think of Donald Trump becoming president? She effectively says, I'm agnostic. My loyalty is to the country. My loyalty is to the presidency. She's talking in terms that are in such stark contrast to what we're hearing from so many of these other administration officials.
Right. She, she personifies that class of experts in Washington, career civil servants, people whose expertise has been built up over years and whose expertise the president has shown no regard for. When Fiona Hill first walked into the White House, was in a meeting, he thought she was there to get him coffee. And what she talks about...
No shocker there.
Right.
What she talked about in that transcript, the White House is going to, and Republicans are going to try to push this strategy. We're seeing them throw all sorts of defenses at the wall here. One of them is that the president didn't know what he was doing. The other might be, well, this was Giuliani or this was Mulvaney or the president wasn't involved in some of these requests, didn't know. In that testimony, what stood out to me was the conversation she had with Gordon Sondland when he says, I'm in charge of Ukraine policy.
Totally
and she
taken
says,
aback
no,
by
you're
that.
not. And he says, yeah, the president says I am. And so she's right there under John Bolton. Her transcript, which came out yesterday, showed so much of Bolton's proximity to a lot of this stuff, but also just puts you in the White House for a lot of these situations as this is coming into her view, and it's pretty clear that this was happening at the direction of the president. The phone call on July 25th, that's just sort of the tipping point that sparked the whistleblower complaint. But this goes back months to when people first realized that Rudy Giuliani was over in Ukraine sort of freelancing.
You bring up John Bolton. Katie, I'll turn to you on this point, getting back to the subpoena issue. There's this extraordinary memo from John Bolton's lawyers yesterday indicating that there's more that John Bolton knows. And to what Eli's saying, he is in such close proximity, yes, to these principles, to Fiona Hill, certainly the President of the United States as well. How do you read this? The tantalizing tidbit there that he knows more, seemingly has an appetite to talk about it or to write about it.
He wants to come forward, but he doesn't feel like he can because
the constraints are self-imposed.
And here's what's happening, and it seems to be a specialty of the Trump administration. It's the bastardization of the law. The law by lawyers, by the way, which is very disturbing. As a member of the bar, we have an oath, we have professional responsibility codes of conduct. And the bastardization of the law has been now you don't comply with lawfully issued subpoenas until somebody tells you you have to. Well, yes, you can run to court to be able to get some guidance on this, but to Andrew's point about hearing from the people that know what's going on, more accurately, isn't it who we're not hearing from? Bolton, Mulvaney, Perry. I mean, there's this series of Giuliani. I mean, there's a series of people from whom we're not hearing, and those are the people that are right next to it. And I think what's really smart about the public hearings is when you present a case, when you're in trial, we have this primacy recency concept. The first thing you hear and the last thing you hear. So when you lead off with a Taylor, a Kent, and Yovanovitch, I would say Vindman for last. And I would stick a few people in between in terms of the public hearings, but that's the order that I would do for these public hearings.
So I want to play a little bit of tape here. We've heard Republicans, as you say, defending this or trying to defend this, dancing around all of this. Play a little bit of tape from a couple of lawmakers responding to what we've learned about the president, about this case over these last few weeks.